It's something that many in Canada don't quite get about our neighbors to the south. While religion is officially separate from the state, it's anything but separable from understanding the United States. Celebrated novelist and essayist Marilynne Robinson takes up the subject with her new book, What Are We Doing Here? And she joins us now for more. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Well, thank you.
I can't believe you're actually here in the studio. Thank you for visiting TVO.
Well, enjoy it.
The title of this book is What Are We Doing Here? Do you have an answer to that question?
No, it's a real question. I mean, I mean it at several levels, you know. On the one hand, I think that, for example, the arts and religion and the humanities and so on create a sense of the meaning of human presence that is extremely valuable to every civilization. On the other hand, I think that there are currents in society now that would undercut each of those things, you know.
And what's that?
Well, take religion. I think there are lots of people who are making very cynical and opportunistic use of religion at this point, which may give them short-term benefit and do very great harm to the society at large, you know.
Do you find religion more unifying or more divisive right now in this time?
Well, you know, I mean, historically in the United States, we've had a great deal of religious diversity. That's basically what the country was for in the first place, you know. And I think that we have a history of living very harmoniously with the assumption that there will be a great deal of diversity of religion in the country. Suddenly this strange idea, really strange historically speaking, that there should be a sort of religious monoculture, you know, that people should be, you know, qualified or disqualified from office by their willingness to subscribe to a certain kind of religious view and so on. That's a novelty. It's made religion divisive where historically there was no reason for it to be divisive.
Religion will come up again in our conversation.
Yes.
But I wanted to follow up with, is writing nonfiction a more effective way of getting your ideas across than fiction?
I don't really write fiction to get ideas across. I think of fiction as an exploration of consciousness and character, and, you know, my novels have a historical background, but then I think any novel must, practically.
Why does it have to have a historical background?
Well, any fiction occurs somewhere at some time. Mm-hmm. And both somewhere and sometime are defined by what has happened previously and what's been important in the minds of people who would live there then, you know. Nonfiction is kind of a separate thing. Well, it is a separate thing. Just as a sort of citizen of a country and so on, I have anxieties and interests and so on that I moved to study historically in many cases, you know.
What are some of your anxieties?
Well, you know, we have been learning over the last year that a great deal of what we consider to be securely the nature of the American government and so on was actually based on people's norms, people's sense of decency or dignity, you know. And so that all sorts of what appeared to be safeguards turn out to be vulnerable to abuses of many kinds. And so I have an impulse to try to move back toward a core definition of, you know, historical issues like freedom of religion and so on, as a way of, in my own thinking, correcting back from abuses I think that our traditions are suffering now.
You're a practicing Christian. How does that inform the way that you look at the world?
Well, you know, I'm, as you say, a practicing Christian, and I have been for probably my whole life as these things go. And, you know, I enjoy the religious culture that I participate in. The vocabulary of scripture and so on has been profoundly meaningful to me. But I don't know you know, you can't generalize very successfully from one experience. I don't know how it affects my worldview because it's the worldview I've always had, in a sense, you know.
You're also a liberal. You say that in the book, in the essay, which is not something we associate with Christians lately. And maybe I'm making too much of an assumption. Does it feel like a contradiction to be a Christian and a liberal?
No. You know, the very strong liberal impulses in America from the beginning were associated very strongly with religion. I mean, the First Amendment, freedom of religion in the first place, you know, these early protections of things like free speech and so on, came out of a very highly religious culture. The fact that some reversal has occurred that makes it so that these things seem not naturally associated with each other is one of the things that disturbs me.
I'd like to read a part of an essay that you wrote in this book. And it's from a lecture that you gave last year at Trinity Cathedral in Little Rock. And you write, "My mother lived to be 92. She was a sharp-minded woman, aware of her intelligence to the end of her life. She was complicated, and my relationship with her was never easy, but it was interesting, which was probably better for me all in all. With a little difficulty, we finally reached an accommodation, an adult friendship. Then she started watching Fox News." So pick up where that sentence ends. She starts watching Fox News, and that means what for you?
Simply that she adopted a great many attitudes and fears, anxieties of various kinds, even resentments that came to her through media and had no basis in her own life experience, you know. And I find that this is something that has occurred in lots of families in the United States. There's a genius of polarization at work that can make people identify very passionately with attitudes that they could not really justify. You know what? I think there's a kind of a hobby of fear, a sort of fear fad, that makes people who are historically as secure as human beings ever are, nevertheless feel as if they have to be ready to defend themselves in extreme situations and so on. It's very irrational, very unattractive, very undignified.
I find that interesting, a hobby of fear. So is that being presented to us by corporations or within our own circles?
I would like to know. I would not have thought that it could assume the importance that it has assumed, you know. I mean, there are the sort of housebound elderly. There are, I'm afraid, especially vulnerable to this. And then there are also sort of men with paramilitary fantasies, you know? And these two populations being of one mind, I think, is quite extraordinary. But, you know, there it is. I'm surprised by it. I would have to do a lot of exploring to be able to reason back to its sources.
Why does there seem to be an overlap between people who watch Fox News and Christianity?
That's the oddest thing. I think that, I mean, there is a whole tradition, a whole culture of liberal Christianity in America, but it tends to be very quietist, really, you know. It does go back to the Mayflower. It's not an innovation. It's not a liberalization in the sense of any easing of standards or anything. But for some reason, I think for good reasons, they're very hesitant to criticize other people's religion, you know. I think that they were surprised, that we've been surprised by the fact that a whole huge branch of Christianity would sort of mutate into a political ideology.
Do you think that the left looks down on religion too much?
It depends who the left are. I mean, there is a religious left. And then, you know, there is a myth of resistance to religion on the part of the left, on the part of the, you know, this is one of the things that's propagated all the time from these people on the right, you know. But I write things, I write theology, I write religious fiction, you know, my characters are ministers and so on. And people will say to me, aren't you afraid of that? You know, like I'm going to set off some huge antagonistic response somewhere. Never. Not a word. The New York Times is very kind to me. The Nation is very kind to me.
You're celebrated.
I, I'm very happy with the response that my writing has had. But the idea, atheists have been very kind to my books. People of every religious persuasion have been kind to my books. I think that it's embarrassing that people can be shamed into silence by the thought that out there somewhere is someone who will say something derisive, It just has no part in my experience.
What do you make of the evangelical support of Donald Trump?
Oh, it's just appalling to me, just appalling. I can't imagine. They do very, very assertive things that have very profound impact on people's lives. And at the same time, they, we will overlook this stupidity and that disaster because somehow or other he's one of us, although he's not, conspicuously is not one of anybody. I think the only people he resembles are people in his administration. But, they have given Trump a great deal of power to do things that I consider to be very, very unreflective, inhumane. How they can justify it, I can't imagine.
Do you think that diminishes the worldview of what being a Christian is?
Oh, no question about it. Religions are basically judged, even by people that are culturally associated with them, by the kind of action in the world that they sponsor and encourage and inculcate, And again, it just seems to me as if, there are certain things that are basically forbidden to Christians, as I understand the religion. One of them is resentment. One of them is hostility to the stranger, which the Bible forbids 1,000 times, There are so many things like that you just go down the list. And there are things that one branch of American religion, I'm afraid world religion, is, guilty of almost contempt for, it would seem.
And without irony, a group that Trump rails against are the elites. Mm-hmm. How strong is anti-elitism within Christianity?
Well, it just, in my particular version of Christianity, I don't think the issue ever arose, it's a very worldly way of judging things, really. A human soul is a human soul who may or may not have gone to graduate school. That's a very peripheral, very marginal consideration. It's odd to have these people rallying around, certainly the wealthiest government that the United States has ever had. They seem to be willing to fudge a little bit in order to enhance their wealth, or fudge a lot. But if they use their own economic standards, they certainly would have to call themselves an elite. I don't know how in the world they have managed to persuade other people of anything else except simply by conjuring the idea that there is another hostile elite. An elite based on education and reading and thought.
Well, former President Barack Obama was a Christian. He is a Christian, mm-hmm. but he was never perceived as one. Why do you think that was?
Well, it's polemical, They brand people as not Christian, and this disqualifies them from the attention of people who claim to be Christians in that other style, which is again startling. I think it's a departure from the way things have been dealt with as religious issues in the country historically.
Do you think he did enough to make him present himself as a Christian?
Well, if I didn't write books, I don't know what I would be doing to present myself as a Christian. He's a completely kind, considerate, truth-loving, scandal-free man who, in terms of his actual behavior in the world, would be a functional definition of a Christian man. He doesn't use the word, to describe himself because he was also the president of an extremely diverse country, you know, and not more the president of the Christians than he was of the Jews or the Muslims, you know. So I think he navigated the religious question in a way that was completely consistent with his own religious view.
I want to read something else from the book of essays.
Okay.
You write, "It is no accident that Marxism and social Darwinism arose together, two tellers of one tale. It is not surprising that they have disgraced themselves in very similar ways. Their survival more than 150 years on is probably owed to the symmetry of their supposed opposition. Based on a single paradigm, they reinforce each other as legitimate modes of thought. So it is with our contemporary left and right. Between them, we circle in a maelstrom of autofactuousness." What direction do you see this rift between left and right heading in?
Well,
Down the drain?
I did use that metaphor. A maelstrom is a big drain. No, it's really quite a dramatic drain. Well, you know, the thing that bothers me so much is that people are so engrossed in this dynamic of false opposition that they're using a false vocabulary and they're defining false issues and they are, you know what I mean? It's like the whole conversation has spiraled away from anything that could be politically meaningful in the positive sense.
Do you see those groups coming back together?
I don't think they've been together since the Civil War.
And do you see anyone who would be able to maybe bring them together?
No, I mean, not now, not on this political landscape. But, you know, you can arrive at a peaceable kind of, if the consensus is that we're one country and we ought to work things out, then you have that's as much unity as we actually need, you know. And in any given election, one side gets 51%, the other gets 49%, you know. So there's no, you know, it's not as if we ever merge together and 80% vote one way or anything like that. I mean, maybe under Franklin Roosevelt or something, but generally what we've done is divide along certain lines, elaborate opinions within those lines, have a public conversation every 2 years, 4 years, and then live with the consequence of an election, you know? That's the unity we need.
What role do you see your writing in these polarizing times?
Well, I would like to urge people beyond polarization, you know? I think that we have to talk in a more objective way about American history, for example, where the institutions come from, what they mean, how they have persisted over time, and so on, you know. I try to reintroduce other kinds of concepts than are in the general academic or public conversation.
What are those? What are some of those concepts?
Well, I mean, one of the things that obviously fascinates me in a negative sort of way is that the history of the colonization of the Northeast is profoundly slighted by historians. And often, I mean, the Puritan part of America over against the southern part of America had different economics, different religious culture, different, I mean, you know, like all the publishing that went on in that period was done in New England and New York, you know. All the educating, for the most part, was done in New England and New York. When people spread out into the Middle West in order to, you know, to keep those states from becoming slave states, they took education and publishing with them and so on. So an enormous amount of the important cultural history of the United States came out of that quadrant, and it was descended very directly from the English Civil War, in which issues like freedom of the press, freedom of religion, you know, all sorts of social innovations. For example, the idea that both doctors and lawyers should be paid from the public purse rather than the cost falling on the people who needed their services. This is already an idea that's current in the 17th century. So in other words, we have a vastly different narrative of origins to make if we look at the Northeast rather than merging everything together and taking something that happened in Carolina and saying that was characteristic of American political culture. That was British law, not American law.
Marilynne Robinson, I wish we had more time to talk.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here and for giving us so much to think about in this collection of essays. What are we doing here? It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For me also.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.